He had the face that stopped traffic. On stage, he commanded silence with a whisper. Off stage, he was drowning. In 1956, one crash erased the line between the man the world adored and the man slowly disappearing. His name was Montgomery Clift, and for a decade after that May evening on a California road, he lived what his closest colleagues called the longest suicide in Hollywood history. But before that fatal trajectory, Clift reinvented what it meant to be a leading man in American cinema, and the cost of that revolution never stopped mounting. Montgomery Clift was born Edward Montgomery Clift on October 17, 1920, in Omaha, Nebraska, just after his twin sister Roberta, and into a world his mother had already scripted for him. His father, William Brooks Clift, was a wealthy banker. His mother, Ethel Sonny Anderson, had been born out of wedlock and spent the family fortune and her entire life chasing a blue-blooded aristocratic past for her children. Monty, as everyone called him, grew up traveling through Europe, privately tutored in Swiss boarding schools and Bermuda estates. But the stock market crash of 1929 upended that mythology. The family fortune evaporated. They settled, humiliated, into a modest Florida town. By age 13, Monty had found his true home, the stage. He appeared in a local production, and his mother, sensing something unstoppable, steered him toward Broadway. In 1933, at just 14 years old, Clift auditioned and won a part in Fly Away Home, a Broadway play that would launch a theatrical legend. For more than a decade, he remained loyal to the stage, honing an acting technique that would later revolutionize cinema itself. He studied under the finest directors. He earned glowing reviews. He became known in theater circles as one of the most committed, psychologically driven performers alive. Yet he refused Hollywood. He saw the film industry as shallow, commercial, a place where craft went to die under studio contracts and manufactured images. Offstage, though, he was already learning to hide. In the early 1940s, while working in New York theater, he encountered Libby Holman, a wealthy, former Broadway star who became obsessed with him. She funded experimental plays for him, gave him advances, and pursued him with an intensity that would last more than a decade. Friends noticed his discomfort with her advances, and with the advances of numerous actresses who seemed drawn to something ineffable and untouchable in him. Clift was, by all accounts, profoundly private about matters of the heart. What few realized was that he was already constructing walls. Then came the call from Hollywood that he could not refuse. In 1946, director Howard Hawks invited him to star opposite John Wayne in Red River, a Western epic that would become a classic. Reluctantly, Clift agreed to make 2 films before committing to a longer deal. The result was seismic. In Red River, Clift played a sensitive, conflicted young man facing off against Wayne's authoritarian rancher, a pairing that shocked audiences accustomed to uniform heroic types. His performance was raw, vulnerable, psychologically complex. Critics called it a revelation. What was happening on screen was the birth of a new kind of masculinity, one that would reshape not just Hollywood, but the very definition of what a leading man could be. Clift had brought method acting, the technique championed by Lee Strasberg and Elia Kazan, to the mainstream film industry. He didn't play roles, he inhabited them. He spoke in whispers when his character demanded it, used long pauses to communicate internal struggle, moved with an awkward grace that read as authenticity. Marlon Brando would follow. James Dean would follow. But Montgomery Clift arrived first. In 1948, after Red River's success, Clift negotiated something unprecedented, a 3-picture deal that granted him unusual creative control and leverage over which projects he would accept. This single contract rewrote the star-studio relationship for the next 40 years. Studio executives suddenly faced an actor who would not be molded, controlled, or manufactured. Clift returned to New York between films, renting cheap hotel rooms when he had to work on the West Coast, spending evenings reading Chekhov, and attending late-night court proceedings to study real people. He had no interest in the party circuit, the nightclub scene, the machinery of Hollywood glamour. His resistance to the system was absolute. In the early 1950s, Clift ascended to genuine stardom. His performance, opposite Elizabeth Taylor in A Place in the Sun, 1951, became iconic. Their chemistry was electric, and the film, a tragedy of desire and class conflict, cemented Clift's reputation as one of cinema's finest actors. He was nominated for Academy Awards: The Heiress, 1949, Red River, 1948, A Place in the Sun, 1951, and From Here to Eternity, 1953. He won 0. Yet his influence was undeniable. Directors wanted him. Studios courted him. By the early 1950s, Montgomery Clift was considered one of the finest actors working in American cinema. But success had a price. Hollywood began to speculate relentlessly about his private life. Why was he never seen with a steady woman? Why did he keep company with men? The gossip was vicious in those years, though it remained mostly whispered, never printed. Clift's reclusive nature, his refusal to perform the rituals of star culture, his apparent indifference to romantic scandal, all of it fueled speculation. What insiders knew was that he had had serious relationships with men, including theater actor William Lamacena and choreographer Jerome Robbins. When Robbins later conceived West Side Story, rumors circulated that Clift had inspired the basic plot, a Romeo and Juliet scenario told through warring gangs in New York. Whether true or not, the connection spoke to something, that Robbins had been shattered when Clift left New York for Hollywood in 1948. And that loss, however it was channeled, changed the shape of American theater. Yet Clift had also been linked to women. His relationships were real, but few, and genuinely private. What mattered, though, was that in the 1950s, homosexuality was not just taboo, it was criminal. It was a career-ending catastrophe for an actor, especially one who played traditionally masculine roles. Clift lived in constant psychological tension between his authentic self and the persona he had to maintain. He began drinking heavily long before the accident that would later define his descent. He took pills, first for headaches, then for anxiety, then for pain that had no clear source. By the mid-1950s, substance dependence was already reshaping his life, though few outsiders acknowledged it. Then came May 12, 1956. Clift had been filming Raintree County, a Civil War drama. That evening, driving home from a party at Elizabeth Taylor's house in the Hollywood Hills, he veered off Coldwater Canyon Road and struck a telephone pole head-on. The impact was catastrophic. His face shattered. His jaw broke in multiple places. His nose was crushed. According to doctors, it was a miracle he survived it all. Rock Hudson, Michael Wilding, and Kevin McCarthy were at the scene. They formed a protective human shield, so photographers could not capture images of Clift's mangled face as he was carried to the ambulance. The press erupted. Rumors of suicide attempts circulated. There was speculation, too, that he had been intoxicated. Clift was in agonizing pain throughout the long recovery. Surgery after surgery. Month after month of reconstruction. His face would never be the same. When filming resumed on Raintree County, a different man returned to set. The accident had left him in chronic pain that demanded medication. Alcohol, prescription pills, sedatives, anything to numb the physical and psychological devastation. What happened next is where the true tragedy crystallized. The 1956 car crash did not end Clift's career. It inverted it. He continued to work, continuing to deliver powerful performances, even as his body and mind deteriorated. In The Young Lions, 1958, Marlon Brando, himself a tormented soul, warned Clift that he was destroying himself. In Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, Clift gave an astonishing performance alongside Spencer Tracy, Judy Garland, and Burt Lancaster, earning his 4th Academy Award nomination. He was still intermittently brilliant, but the gaps between performances grew longer. The pain was constant. The alcohol flowed. He became unreliable. He missed call times. Universal Studios sued him for production delays on Freud, 1962, claiming his health issues had cost them millions. Friends watched in horror as the beautiful, sensitive, revolutionary actor seemed to be erasing himself in real time. His biographer, Robert LaGuardia, noted something singular about Clift's acting method. He used inner silence, unusual pauses, awkward movements, and a voice so quiet he was sometimes inaudible. On screen, this created a haunting intensity. Off-screen, it may have been a survival mechanism, a way to contain things that could not be spoken aloud in the Hollywood of the 1950s and 1960s. By the early 1960s, Clift's film career was in free fall despite his talent. He retreated to New York, purchasing a townhouse at 217 East 61st Street in Manhattan. It became his fortress and, ultimately, his tomb. He filled it with art, antiques, and a teak bar cart that seemed to grow more important each year. He painted the facade bright orange and installed matching window awnings, eccentricities that drew complaints from neighbors. But inside, he was systematizing his own destruction. Friends and colleagues described watching him disappear. He was thinner. His hands shook. His speech grew slurred. The pills and alcohol had become the central organizing principle of his day. Yet, he was still capable of grace. He mentored younger actors. He welcomed close friends. He existed in a strange, liminal space. Publicly absent, privately vivid to those few who could reach him. In 1966, as Clift entered his final years, he was offered a role in Reflections in a Golden Eye, a complex part that, had he survived, might have showcased his mature artistry. But on the night of July 22, 1966, something in him simply quit. He was at home with Lorenzo James, his live-in nurse, and companion reading in bed. Around midnight, James asked if he wanted to watch a late-night rebroadcast of The Misfits, one of Clift's own films from 1961, in which he had starred alongside Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe. "Absolutely not!" Clift exclaimed, his last recorded words. James went to bed. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., James found the bedroom door locked and no response. He climbed through a back window and found Clift lying nude on top of his bed, dead. The autopsy ruled it occlusive coronary artery disease, a heart attack. He was 45 years old. Acting teacher Robert Lewis would later call it the longest suicide in Hollywood history. It was a phrase that captured something true about Clift's final decade: the slow, systematic erasure of a man who had revolutionized American acting, but could find no sanctuary in the world that revolution had created. He had been too revolutionary, too honest, too unwilling to perform the acceptable lies. In his refusal to hide, in his psychological depth, in his vulnerability on screen, he had inadvertently created the space for other sensitive men, Brando, Dean, and countless others, to exist in Hollywood. Yet he had paid an unbearable price for being first. Today, more than half a century later, Clift's legacy has begun to shift. A 2018 documentary by his nephew, Robert Anderson Clift, worked to separate the myths from the man, to clarify the narratives that had grown distorted over decades. Historians have noted that much of the shame and sexuality narrative around Clift was likely oversimplified or invented. Friends and family have stated he was not deeply conflicted about being gay, but rather about the world's inability to accept it. The real tragedy was not his private self, but the cost of pretending it did not exist. What we know now is that Montgomery Clift did not fail at life. The world failed him. He arrived too early, in a time when sensitivity and ambiguity in a man was read as a pathology to be hidden, rather than a gift to be honored. His final films grew sparse and forgettable, not because he lost his talent, but because he had already been erased by pain, by pills, by a system that could celebrate his artistry but could never celebrate his truth. In the end, the most revolutionary thing about Montgomery Clift was not what he did on screen, but what he refused to do off it. He refused to disappear into the persona. And for that, he paid with his life. If you've ever felt the weight of living behind a mask, of the glamour that costs everything, and the privacy that demands silence, Clift's story is yours too. His tragedy is not historical. It is human. And that is why it matters now, as much as it ever did.